Today is Saturday, October 12th. We live in a society that's more connected than ever because of technology. And yet, the U.S. Surgeon General recently called loneliness an epidemic. Gen Z in particular reports feeling lonelier than young people have in the past. So, what's going on? Dr. Marisa G. Franco is a psychologist, New York Times bestselling author, and professor at the University of Maryland. She's a sought-after friendship and belonging expert who wrote the book Platonic, which explores how to make new friends and deepen connections you already have. Today, she joins us to talk about why there's a loneliness epidemic, the impact of loneliness on individuals and society as a whole, and what we can all do about it. This is a great and important conversation that even offers practical advice for anyone looking for new friends or deeper connections in a changing, sometimes chaotic world. Welcome to the Newsworthy Special Edition Saturday, when we sit down with a different expert or celebrity every Saturday to talk about something in the news. Don't forget to tune in every Monday through Friday for our regular episodes, where we provide all the day's news in 10 minutes. I'm Erica Mandy. It's now time for today's Special Edition Saturday. Dr. Marisa G. Franco, thank you so much for joining us here on the Newsworthy.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we've heard a lot about this ongoing loneliness epidemic in America that seemingly impacts all ages. The U.S. Surgeon General warned about it last year. Can you talk about what exactly the term loneliness epidemic means and your thoughts on whether it's really happening?
Yeah, so isolation is the state of not being around other people, but loneliness is the subjective feeling of wanting more social connection than you have. Regarding whether I think it's actually happening, absolutely. I mean, we have seen rates of loneliness steadily increasing since like the 1950s, with a large jump around 2012, which happened to be when smartphones became more popular.
Yeah, and so that's the next question is how did we get here? What are the potential causes?
So Robert Putnam has this great book, Bowling Alone, where he explores why is nobody going to the bowling alley anymore. And out of all of his research, the reason that he finds most compelling is the television. Because before the TV, people spent their leisure time around others. Then they spent it in their four walls. They got this parasocial connection of feeling connected to people in the show, kind of like a snack of connection, but not the nutrient-dense meal. And not only that watching TV encouraged this general lethargy, such that even after they were done with the TV show, they didn't want to do anything else. And so you could see how these same factors that made the TV kind of an instrument of isolation have also occurred with the smartphone. We find more generally that those people that use the smartphone to connect with people in person are actually the least lonely of everyone. But those folks who are using the smartphone to replace in-person connection, who are coming home and just scrolling on their phones, they tend to be the most lonely of everybody.
Yeah, and I want to highlight that point you just mentioned, actually, because there is that argument that yes, technology has potentially been a cause of increased feelings of loneliness, but at the same time, you can connect with people better. So can you expand on how the way that people use technology is really impactful?
So the research finds that the impact of technology on loneliness depends on how you use it. If you are a passive user, scrolling, your mental health is going to get poorer. You're going to experience greater likelihood of loneliness. But if you are an active user, which means I'm reaching out to people, I'm leaving comments, I'm posting things, I'm, DMing people to hang out in person, I'm finding out about events where I can go to in person, then generally you are going to be less lonely and your mental health is going to be better.
I'm curious if you've heard of these AI companion apps. The Wall Street Journal recently had an article that was analyzing some of them and found that they actually can help people who feel lonely, that they're designed to validate feelings and that sort of thing. Have you heard about this, and what do you think?
I think when it comes to AI, I just want it to be used as like a bridge to in-person connection. So to the extent that loneliness, it's not just a feeling, it makes us feel more threatened by others, more judgmental of them, more likely to fear rejection. It puts us into a state where we're hypervigilant for threat. So to the extent that these AI apps can make you feel less of that so that you're more prepared to go interact in person, that it doesn't feel as threatening and scary for you, then I think that can be positive. But to the extent that people are then relying on the AI app and not interacting in person, then it really does concern me, because fundamentally what we've seen in the research is that in-person connection with other human beings is just irreplaceable.
I imagine that remote work, for all of its benefits and flexibility, has there also been a downside that we aren't getting those automatic connections at work?
I imagine that it depends on whether you have the kind of workplace that like you would rather withdraw from, or the kind of beneficial workplace where if you were in person, you would feel more connected. For example, like I've seen some research that like for Black employees, they might actually feel better about being online because they're experiencing more like microaggressions or discrimination at work. So that's part of like why I think it's a bit complicated. I think if all workplaces were like healthy and nurturing and connecting, then absolutely remote work would take away from that. But because a lot of workplaces don't feel safe or comfortable and people feel very inauthentic at work, then there's a case to be made that not necessarily.
What are some of the impacts or dangers of loneliness, both, mentally and physically?
Lonely people are like over 10 times more likely to both think about and attempt suicide in their lives, like grave impacts on mental health. When you looked at research that looks at 106 factors that prevent against depression, having someone to confide in is the number one thing that prevents against depression. So you can say that it's almost impossible to be mentally healthy if you're chronically lonely. Just like to be healthy, we need food and oxygen and water. We also need connection. In terms of physical health, that actually surprises people. I mean, the commonly cited statistic is loneliness is as toxic as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, which is wild because how many of us would never smoke 15 cigarettes a day but are used to being lonely? But we also see, for example, that loneliness is related to Alzheimer's progressing much more rapidly. It's related to people that get vaccinated. The vaccines are less effective on them if they're lonely. So it really does get under our skin. It's like loneliness is like being in a state of chronic stress. Lonely people also engage in what's called like hyper wakes, where they wake up, they tend to have more disruptive sleep because they're waking up for like milliseconds to like scan the room for threat. So it's being in a state where you're in chronic stress, hyper vigilant to stress, and that does a lot of wear and tear on your body.
I want to be clear. Everybody feels lonely sometimes, right? So how lonely do you have to feel, or for how long before it actually becomes problematic?
I think the sort of chronically lonely people have the worst health impacts when it comes to loneliness. And so those are what you can see, like from someone who's chronically lonely, how you can tell is that they tend to have this hopelessness around finding connection. You'll hear them say things like, you just can't trust people at the end of the day, or people are really out to get you, or they just don't see connection as fundamentally rewarding anymore, or that hostility is turned inward, where they're just like, I'm pathetic or I'm worthless and nobody wants to hang out with me. And so once it gets internalized and continues to impact both how you see other people in a more enduring way or how you see yourself in a more enduring way, then that's when loneliness is particularly concerning.
What would you say to somebody who is like introverted and doesn't like to be around a lot of people versus somebody who's lonely? Can you differentiate that a little bit?
Yeah, so loneliness is this subjective feeling that you don't have the level of connection that you want. And so if you're introverted and you're like, this is cool, this is my alone time, if it feels like an offering to you and rather than a deficit, then that's a sign that this is solitude for you and it's not loneliness. But introverts too, like myself, we get to a point where we're like, oh, actually, I would prefer to be around other people and be connected to other people. And then it sort of slinks away from solitude and it becomes loneliness.
What about the impact of loneliness on a societal level?
Well, when you're in a lonely society, it's a lot harder for people to stay connected, right? Because if lonely people withdraw from social connection because they feel threatened, all the people that would have reached out to you are now not. And that's why I think it's really hard for Gen Z, because they're facing highest rates of loneliness of any generation. So for example, there's one study that found that if someone close to you becomes lonely, you are then 52% more likely to become lonely yourself.
You mentioned Gen Z. Do you think that's the group that's now particularly at risk for loneliness?
There tends to be a U-shaped curve such that Gen Z, the youngest generation, and the folks that are oldest tend to be the most at risk for loneliness. I'm particularly concerned with Gen Z because it used to be maybe 15 years ago before the smartphones that this wasn't true. There wasn't this U-shaped relationship with loneliness where the youngest generation was the most lonely. And so that's a more recent development.
Still ahead, Dr. Franco has practical and specific advice for making new friends, even as we all try to navigate the chaos of daily life already. I also ask her, is quality or quantity of friends more important? And Dr. Franco addresses the impact of spending time with friends on our romantic relationships. That and more still coming up. But first, a quick break for our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by Lumen. Lumen is the world's first handheld metabolic coach. It's a device that measures your metabolism through your breath. As I've been using it, I've learned so much about how my metabolism and body works, and I love how easy and fun Lumen is to use. Again, all you have to do is breathe into your Lumen first thing in the morning, and you'll see what's going on with your metabolism. Then on the app, it lets you know if you're burning fat or carbs and gives you tailored guidance to improve your nutrition, workout, sleep, and even stress management. You can also breathe into it before and after workouts and meals, so you get real-time data and recommendations. Your metabolism is actually your body's engine. It's how your body turns the food you eat into fuel that keeps you going. This is the type of technology that used to only be available to top athletes in clinics, but now Lumen makes lab-level metabolic testing accessible. So if you want to take the next step in improving your health, go to lumen.me/newsworthy to get 15% off your Lumen. That's lumen.me/newsworthy for 15% off your purchase. Thank you, Lumen, for sponsoring this episode. The Newsworthy is also brought to you by Shopify. When you think about businesses that are really successful and well-known, there's usually a few things there: a great product or service, a cool brand, and excellent marketing. And what you may not realize is how much the business behind the business matters too. One key thing, making selling and buying simple. For millions of businesses, they're able to do that thanks to Shopify. And I know as a customer that's used Shopify at checkout, it's such a smooth experience, so I'm ready to buy again and again. Nobody does selling better than Shopify. In fact, it's home to the #1 checkout on the planet. So if you're growing your business, you better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout brands like Allbirds, Skims, Mattel, Heinz, and many more use. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/newsworthy, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/newsworthy to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/newsworthy. Okay, now back to our conversation. Kids at least have, school and activities, but say you move somewhere new, other adults are busy, they may already kind of feel good about the friendships they have and don't need any new ones. So what's your advice for people if they're feeling this kind of chronic loneliness, which probably is more on the severe side of things, but also for adults who just want to make more friends and have more connections and be more part of their communities?
Don't assume it's going to happen organically. As I mentioned in my book, Platonic, when people assume friendship happens organically, they're lonelier over time, whereas when people see it as taking effort, they're less lonely. Join something repeated over time. Don't go to a happy hour, join a professional development group, because when you see people in a repeated way, you capitalize on something called mere exposure, which is our tendency to like people who are familiar. Assume that it's going to be awkward at first because you don't have familiarity and you don't have mere exposure and you're going to be more uncomfortable. And my last tip is assume people will like you, because the research finds that we overestimate our likelihood of being rejected. People are more open to us than we think. If 50% of people are lonely, 50% of people might be really happy to have you reach out to them. And when you assume that people will like you, it triggers you to be friendlier, more open, warmer to other people. Whereas when you think people will reject you, you become closed off, you become rejecting towards them, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
What's your advice for working parents, for example, who feel that their time is almost completely spoken for already?
Are there things that you're already doing in your day that you can do in a state of connection? Make your friends your colleagues. If you're working from home, can you invite a friend over to co-work right next to you? If you are planning a play date for your kid, could you spend that time hanging out with the other parent of that kid? If you're commuting, could you spend that time calling to check in with a friend, for example? If you're going to work out, could you organize a weekly walking group, weekly hiking group? Like, are there ways that you can creatively infuse connection into the things that are already part of your schedule?
And do you think there's an element of prioritizing your own mental health and connection amidst the chaos?
I absolutely do, because I think a healthy parent makes for a healthier child, and a less stressed parent makes for a less stressed child. And so, sometimes we think of friendship as like antagonistic to family life, but what we see in the data, for example, is that when people hang out with their friends, they are less impacted by conflict with their partners, so that they can then go to their partner in a more centered place. When people hang out with their friends, not only are they less depressed, but their romantic partner is less depressed too. So it's going to create ripple effects for your larger community, your larger family, if you're able to prioritize finding time to connect with other people.
Do you think sometimes it's the other side of things where maybe you do need to end a friendship?
My advice for thinking through ending friendships is I ask people, is the issue you're having with a friend a chapter of your book, or is it the entire book, right? Like, has this person always frustrated you or annoyed you and you've overlooked it and it's coming to a halt? Or is it a specific circumstance or situation that's creating this issue or conflict between you? And so if it's the book, yeah, you might want to end some friendships. Or if it's just like, these friends are not my closest friends and I'm really busy, so I'm going to have to prioritize those people that are most important so that I can prioritize anyone at all, then I think that also makes sense.
What can or should someone do if they notice someone else that is feeling loneliness, especially if they live in a different state or have their own busy life and can't be, the person that ends the loneliness for that other person?
If they're open to having them really sign up for some sort of class or community center, right? Because we need to automate this. Then people don't need to keep reaching out and checking in to find connection. It's default a part of their week. So could you look into some options for them to do that in community so that it's automatically available for them?
In general, is quantity or quality of friends and connections more important?
Well, we see that quality is what promotes mental health more so than quantity. Like I said, like 106 factors that prevent against depression, having someone to confide in, having a very quality relationship of mutual vulnerability is particularly important.
And yet, what is the role of quantity? Because there have been a lot of articles about, people not going to religious institutions as much anymore, or maybe not talking to their neighbors as much anymore, and that there's some consequences of that. What's your take?
Well, there are actually 3 different forms of loneliness: intimate loneliness, the desire for a close, intimate connection; relational loneliness, the desire for a relationship as close as a friend; but also collective loneliness, which is the desire to be part of a group working towards a common goal. So you can have intimate loneliness, you can have intimate connection, relational connection, but you can still find that there's something missing for you. While it may not give you the sort of deep intimacy that is so deeply mental health promoting in the same way, it does allow you to access novelty, which is a fundamental human need, and it allows you to access different sides of yourself because each person brings out different parts of you.
Overall, if there's truly a loneliness epidemic, how do we come out of this? What do we do as a society?
If it's a systemic issue, we need systemic solutions. We need to normalize classes on socio-emotional learning for kids, like policies around social media for kids of a certain age, I think would be really important. UK has a minister of loneliness, for example. Are there grassroots grants we can give for grassroots efforts that people are making to create connection and community for other people?
Final thought.
Well, when my niece read my book, Platonic, she said, for friendship to happen, you have to be brave, so be brave.
Well, thank you so much to our guest today, Dr. Marisa G. Franco. Be sure to check out her New York Times bestselling book, Platonic: How the Science of Attachment Can Help You Make and Keep Friends. Thank you so much for listening today. Stay up to date with all the news to know each weekday with our 10-minute news roundups every Monday through Friday. You can follow us in your favorite podcast app for free so you never miss an episode. We will actually not have a regular Monday episode due to the federal holiday next week, so we'll be back with another news roundup for you on Tuesday. Until then, have a great weekend.